Ford and John Deere recently ceased production in the United States. Trump's reaction wasn't just a statement, it was seen as a warning that echoed across the heartland. In a sudden move, two of America's manufacturing giants abandoned their domestic operations. Jobs vanished, factories fell silent. The president, who had promised to revitalize American manufacturing, responded with aggressive tariffs that risked destabilizing the very communities he aimed to protect. This wasn't merely economic strategy, it felt personal. Why did these iconic companies abandon their American roots? Why did Trump's retaliation backfire so dramatically? And what are the implications for jobs, savings, and the future? What many didn't realize, perhaps even Trump himself, was that John Deere had been quietly shifting its operations long before tariffs were imposed. Months earlier, Deere had begun a global reorganization, new plants in Brazil, advanced automation in Germany, and a major expansion in India, all while scaling back in the US. Internally, Deere executives focused on adapting to potential instability, both in the market and in Washington. They strategically prepared for a future where American politics might become a liability. To them, it wasn't defiance but adaptation, a pragmatic move to reduce exposure to political volatility. For Ford, the exit from U.S. production was a quieter affair compared to John Deere's strategic shift. Unlike Deere, Ford didn't feel the need to make a statement or warn anyone. Their reasons were practical and economic, driven by stability, predictable labor conditions, and regulatory consistency, factors they found lacking in the U.S. environment. To Trump's supporters, these moves seemed like betrayal, but for the executives, it was a logical business decision. You can't sustain billion-dollar operations in an unpredictable environment. In essence, while Trump saw these departures as betrayals, for these companies, it was about survival and long-term strategy in a globalized economy where stability and predictability are paramount. While Trump publicly denounced foreign dependence, Ford had already been quietly constructing its exit plan, and it was nearly complete. Through discreet legal filings and understated investor calls, Ford had gradually shifted key electric vehicle production to Mexico and Vietnam. Contracts were finalized, equipment relocated, and domestic factory expansion projects began to falter, first slowly, then entirely. A once-promised EV plant in Tennessee was scrapped, autonomous vehicle testing in Ohio delayed, and a major tooling upgrade in Kentucky dismantled. But Ford did something even more strategic. It stayed silent. While Trump rallied crowds with populist rhetoric, Ford played a long game in the background. It didn't criticize tariffs or take political sides. Instead, it quietly minimized risk and maximized profits, avoiding public backlash. Why? Because the numbers told the story. Labor was cheaper in Vietnam. Environmental regulations were lighter. Materials were easier to source. Whether tariffs existed or not, the financial logic was undeniable. Ford understood something that Trump either missed or dismissed. Global corporations answer to data, not political loyalty. On the surface, Ford still looked American. Trucks rolled off U.S. assembly lines, flags adorned dealership brochures. But internally, the company had already pivoted. Trump demanded loyalty. Ford answered with spreadsheets. Loyalty doesn't boost shareholder returns. Efficiency does. Trump, unwilling to be made a fool, pushed back. He framed their departure as betrayal. They stabbed us in the back, he wrote on Truth Social. But beneath the fury was a deeper realization. His influence over corporate America was hollow. He had built a brand on promises to revive U.S. manufacturing, touring factories, donning hard hats, calling John Deere a symbol of American excellence. These weren't just companies to him, they were symbols, props in his political narrative. He believed they owed him, but they left, methodically, quietly, and without apology. Trump's loyalty test failed, not because the companies were disloyal, but because it was based on a false assumption that you could manage global corporations the same way you rally voters, with emotion, threats, and slogans. But corporations don't chant, they don't wear hats, they watch markets. And when push came to shove, Ford and Deere didn't bend. They disappeared. Because the truth is, the social contract Trump assumed, I protect you, you stay loyal, was never real. It was theater. Ford and John Deere never needed his protection. What they needed was stability. And in his second term, Trump offered the opposite. What fractured wasn't just a policy, it was a worldview. In the diners of Ohio and the machine shops of Iowa, that break was felt, not with shouts or protests, but with quiet, uneasy recognition. The myth of made in America, of a coming industrial renaissance, of corporate patriotism, it cracked. And in Iowa, it finally shattered. This isn't just about business, it's about belief. We spent weeks digging into the data, the internal memos, the fallout. And if you're getting something honest from this, hit subscribe. It helps us keep going. The Iowa Meltdown was meant to be a rally, a celebration of loyalty, strength, and the return of American industry. But when Trump took the stage, he didn't ignite the crowd. He stunned them. Farmers, factory workers, lifelong Ford loyalists had gathered with kids, flags, and faith. What they got instead was a political explosion. A 200% tariff on John Deere, products built overseas, and a 25% penalty on imported Ford vehicles. The reaction wasn't anger, it was confusion. No one cheered, they calculated. You could see it in their eyes. How much more will a combine cost next season? Can we still afford a new F-Series truck? A few tried to applaud. Most sat tight-lipped, minds reeling, because this wasn't just policy, it was personal. Iowa isn't just flyover country, it's John Deere country, Ford country. These machines aren't status symbols, they're survival tools. When Trump turned on them, he wasn't targeting Wall Street CEOs. He was hitting the tractors that till the land, the trucks that haul livestock, the vans that take kids to school. Then came the quiet exit. No chants, no protests. Just rows of supporters slowly, silently leaving the stadium, like they were waking up from a dream they didn't realize was dangerous. At truck stops and grain elevators, the conversation changed. Some were furious, others heartbroken. Everyone was doing the math. Because what cracked in Iowa wasn't just Trump's popularity, it was the illusion that he and the working class were perfectly aligned. And that crack wasn't going to heal. Meanwhile, in corporate boardrooms, the storm had already been weathered. No panic, no late-night emergency calls. Because Ford and Deere saw it coming. Contingency planning wasn't a backup, it was the plan. While Trump lit fires in the Midwest, in the glass towers of Detroit and Moline, executives were already moving their next piece. The corporate chess game was well underway, and Trump was no longer on the board. By the time the president issued his threats, both Ford and John Deere were already executing plans that had been in motion for months. At Ford headquarters, legal teams had prepared for every possible trade outcome. They weren't reacting to tweets. They had entire war rooms packed with analysts, lawyers, and lobbyists working Congress quietly behind the scenes. Ford's PR department had already drafted talking points tailored for conservative media, spinning the company's overseas shift not as betrayal but as strategic survival, and the messaging worked. Local newspapers in the Rust Belt published op-eds about global competition. Talk radio hosts dismissed the tariffs as minor, temporary bumps in the road. John Deere, meanwhile, played an even more aggressive game. The company had diversified its global supply chain long before Trump's announcement, new routes through Brazil, backup suppliers in India, highly automated plants in Europe on standby. Deere's leadership didn't fear Trump's retaliation. They anticipated it and planned to outlast it. What Trump never grasped was this. You can't bully multinational corporations with slogans. These companies don't answer to nations, they answer to numbers. And in an unstable economy, predictability beats patriotism every time. CEOs weren't confronting Trump on cable news. They were beating him behind the curtain with silence, precision, and data. But out in the towns he once championed, that silence was growing louder. The dealership rebellion. In towns like Ottawa, Iowa, and Van Buren, Arkansas, the first signs of trouble didn't come from protests, but from something smaller. A pause, then quiet. Dealerships that once buzzed with activity, engines humming, small talk between sales, suddenly went still. Service bays sat empty. Salespeople stared at their phones, waiting for customers who never showed. In just days after the tariff announcement, foot traffic dropped nearly 30%. Farmers who had planned to place orders cancelled. Mechanics booked out for weeks now had open schedules. It was like someone flipped a switch, one dealership manager said. Another claimed it was worse than the Great Recession. Layoffs began quietly. Hours were reduced. Sales staff got trimmed. Trump flags disappeared from showroom windows, not out of protest, but survival. Talking politics at the front desk became taboo. Customers weren't just angry, they were anxious, and anxious people don't spend. This wasn't just about sales, it was about identity. These dealerships were more than businesses, they were community anchors. They sponsored Little League, hosted fundraisers, and believed in the promise of American industry, in Trump's promises, in the idea that the Midwest was making a comeback. Now they felt betrayed, left holding the bag while corporations moved on and politicians pointed fingers. The hidden blow from Wall Street. Then came the next hit. The numbers were impossible to ignore. Within weeks, prices for new John Deere combines rose over 25%. F-Series trucks shot out of reach for average buyers. Replacement parts, filters, belts, transmissions were more expensive and harder to find. But the pain wasn't just in receipts, it exploded online. TikTok videos went viral, comparing prices from just 6 months earlier. Facebook groups, for farmers and truckers, lit up with spreadsheets, frustrations, and boycott calls. Hashtags surged. Memes mocked the administration. People weren't just angry, they were documenting their downfall in real time. And through it all, trust deteriorated, not only in Trump or in Ford and Deere, but in the entire American promise that if you worked hard, bought American, and gave back to your community, the system would reward you. That belief was collapsing. Parents who once told their kids that building tractors or trucks was a proud path were now advising them to look elsewhere. Diesel mechanics scanned job boards for warehouse gigs. Dealership managers dusted off resumes and aimed for finance or real estate. Entire communities were being forced to reconsider their futures, and it no longer looked green and yellow or red, white, and blue. It looked foreign, detached. The tariffs were sold as a defense of American industry, but in practice, they were self-inflicted wounds, driving prices up, trust down, and loyalty into the dirt. And for retirees across the Midwest, the worst was still coming. Ford's collapse meant retirement was next. It started with a red line on a screen. By the time Donald Trump walked off the stage in Iowa, Ford's stock was already in freefall. Within 48 hours, Ford lost more than 27% of its market value, tens of billions of dollars wiped out in the time it takes to binge a streaming series. On Wall Street, it was a brutal headline. In rural America, it was a gut punch, because Ford isn't just a car company, it's a financial pillar for millions of working-class Americans. In small towns across Ohio, Michigan, and Indiana, public pension funds had long trusted Ford stock. It was considered a safe bet, a blue-chip symbol of American strength. Firefighters, teachers, sanitation crews, and cops had their retirements tied to those dividends. They didn't need to watch CNBC to know something was wrong. They could feel it. Their statements were shrinking. Phone lines at local credit unions were jammed with nervous retirees. Entire municipalities felt the squeeze. County pension boards held emergency meetings. Volunteer fire departments, once buoyed by investment returns, were suddenly cutting overtime and shelving equipment upgrades. School districts froze hiring, postponed repairs, and quietly braced for budget shortfalls. And this wasn't just theory. It was personal. A man in Toledo, who once worked the line at a shuttered Ford stamping plant, watched his retirement dip below break-even. A retired Indiana teacher saw the dividend she relied on to top off her Social Security vanish overnight. Across the Rust Belt, people had been told to trust American companies, to invest in what they knew. And now those companies were disappearing, taking futures with them. And still, the worst hadn't hit yet. Deere's Wall Street exodus. The collapse of Ford was a shock. What happened next with John Deere was something else entirely. Not a crash, but a controlled withdrawal. The moment Trump confirmed a 200% tariff on AG equipment built abroad, institutional investors didn't wait for spin. They began dumping Deere stock with algorithmic efficiency. In just 5 trading days, Deere lost more than $36 billion in market cap. This wasn't panic, it was precision. Mutual funds rebalanced. Index funds cut exposure. Even the so-called patriotic investment firms, those that usually stuck with American legacy brands on principle, began pulling back. They'd seen enough. Deere wasn't just bleeding money. It had become radioactive. Wall Street wasn't just reacting to a bad quarter. It was abandoning a symbol. Deere, once the unshakable pride of the American heartland, was now a political liability. The idea that certain companies were immune to Washington's storms. That illusion was dead. Investor sentiment flipped almost overnight. This wasn't about loyalty anymore. It was about risk mitigation. Deere's iconic green and yellow brand couldn't compete with red numbers and risk spreadsheets. Inside Deere's headquarters, the scramble was immediate. Damage control went into high gear. Emergency earnings calls were pushed forward. Investor communications were rewritten, twice in the same day. And still, the silence from Main Street spoke loudest. Behind closed doors, Deere's top brass were on the phones, urgently calling lawmakers they'd once schmoozed over steak dinners and private suite tickets. But the political capital had dried up. Wall Street had already delivered its verdict, and it was ruthless. This wasn't just about one company anymore. It was a reckoning, a message. Not even America's most iconic brands were safe from the chaos of a president's whims. If Trump could blindside Deere, no one was off limits, and the C-suites took notice. The CEO rebellion begins. They didn't call it a mutiny, not publicly, But in boardrooms from Manhattan to Silicon Valley, in whisper-only retreats and power dinners under tight security, the titans of American business began to push back. CEOs across industries, automotive, agriculture, logistics, tech, finance, shared one growing concern: instability. Trump's trade policies weren't just political noise anymore, they were operational threats. Tariffs were slapped down with no warning. Once loyal companies were punished without process. Forecasting became a gamble. Legal departments were told to explore constitutional challenges. Economic advisors began drafting internal white papers, arguing that Trump's economic warfare was destabilizing markets and undermining shareholder trust. The donor money. It started flowing, quietly, not to Democrats per se, but to primary challengers, moderate Republicans, anyone who could promise predictability over volatility. No public statements, no flashy headlines. This wasn't protest, it was self-defense. Corporate investments were quietly paused, hiring freezes took hold. Plans for American expansion were shelved, projects previously considered too politically sensitive to offshore were greenlit. From the outside, nothing seemed amiss, but inside the corporate machine, the shift had already begun. These weren't activists, they weren't interested in making headlines, they were survivalists, and the calculation was simple. Trump had become a business liability. The Mexico-China-Vietnam pivot. While boardrooms scrambled, average Americans woke up to a different kind of betrayal, not from companies, but from the government they thought had their back. And by the time they noticed, the shift was already done. The great American industrial revival. Outsourced. Not later, now, and not temporarily, permanently. In Guanajuato, Mexico, Ford was wrapping up construction on a next-generation EV plant. Giant steel and glass complexes shimmered in the sun, cathedrals to a future that no longer included Dearborn. John Deere's new supplier network stretched from Pune, India, to Recife, Brazil, bypassing traditional U.S. distribution centers entirely. Meanwhile, in Shenzhen, Chinese robotics firms were shipping fully automated assembly units to global agriculture and auto firms, replacing skilled Midwestern labor with unblinking 24/7 precision. This wasn't anecdotal, it was systemic. In just 5 years, American industrial investment plummeted by double digits. Meanwhile, Mexico's capital spending hit historic highs. From Baja to Querétaro, megazones of highly wired, fully automated. Manufacturing hubs were rising, supply chains were optimized, operations integrated, regulations minimal, labor inexpensive. Vietnam, once a footnote in global trade, had become a key node in the supply chain for light manufacturing, battery tech, and precision parts, jobs that used to belong to families in Indiana, Illinois, and Pennsylvania. America wasn't losing a trade war. It was being written out of the story, and the wildest part? Corporate America didn't ask for permission. It didn't wait for Washington to fix the policy mess. It didn't care about campaign promises or patriotic platitudes. It acted on a single, unflinching metric: survival. Labor was cheaper overseas. Tax breaks were better, supply chains were faster. Environmental oversight was lighter or non-existent. From a boardroom's view, the decision was cold but clear. Making things in America had become a risk. Trump's 200% tariff on Deere's foreign-built equipment wasn't a deterrent. It was a confirmation. Ford and John Deere made a calculated decision to quietly move operations out of the U.S., not as a temporary reaction to political or economic volatility, but as a permanent shift in strategy. While some still believe these moves are short-term responses, those familiar with corporate decision-making know otherwise. These companies are not just reacting, they're evolving. The U.S., once a manufacturing powerhouse, has become too unpredictable, bogged down by tariffs, regulations, and cultural conflict, making it less attractive compared to countries like India and Mexico, which offer cheaper labor, expanding markets, and favorable trade terms. Ford and Deere didn't make public announcements. They simply deleted future commitments with quiet cuts and buried memos because they knew how abandonment would sound to American workers. The fallout has been severe. Farmers face inflated costs and delayed equipment, factory towns are hollowed out, and the middle class is disintegrating. This wasn't just an economic collapse, it was emotional, a betrayal wrapped in corporate pragmatism and political theatrics. In the end, no one truly won. Not Trump, not the corporations, not Wall Street. What's left is a broken bond between government, business, and the American people. And unless drastic changes are made, the middle class may soon be nothing more than a memory, just another thing we used to build in America. John Deere, once a cornerstone of American agricultural manufacturing and a symbol of rural strength, is quietly but deliberately relocating major parts of its production out of the United States, marking a profound shift in its long-term strategy. This isn't a temporary reaction to economic volatility or political friction. It's a calculated evolution driven by global efficiency and profitability. The company has moved key assembly lines from traditional hubs in Illinois and Iowa to countries like Mexico and India, capitalizing on dramatically lower labor costs, access to fast-growing markets, and favorable trade conditions. What makes this shift even more striking is the silence that accompanied it. There were no big announcements, no press releases, no community engagement, just a few lines buried in shareholder presentations and earnings calls. This stealthy exit has left American workers blindsided, their jobs quietly erased, and their local economies thrown into disarray. Farmers, who long relied on the accessibility and reliability of John Deere equipment, now face soaring costs, delays in service, and back-ordered machinery, all while watching the company chase overseas profits. Meanwhile, small towns that revolved around Deere's presence, dealerships, repair shops, schools, restaurants, are slowly hollowing out, caught in the economic vacuum left behind. This isn't just about cost-cutting. It's about a loss of trust and loyalty. Deere's departure reflects a broader trend among multinational corporations that now view America as a risky, unpredictable place to do business, riddled with tariffs, legal threats, and political theatrics. In contrast, countries like India and Mexico offer clarity, growth, and labor flexibility that the U.S. no longer provides. For the communities affected, there was no fight, no negotiation, just a quiet, calculated retreat. John Deere isn't looking back, and its decisions signal a sobering truth. The era of American manufacturing loyalty is over, and the consequences are being felt most painfully by the very middle class that built these companies into global giants. Ford, once synonymous with American industry and blue-collar strength, is undergoing a quiet but decisive transformation that reflects deep shifts in the global automotive landscape and a growing disconnection from its U.S. manufacturing roots. Rather than doubling down on domestic investment, Ford has been steadily pulling back, redirecting capital and production abroad, particularly to Mexico and other more cost-effective markets. This isn't framed publicly as abandonment, but the signs are clear. Plant investments once touted as job creators are now quietly cancelled or delayed, with announcements buried in earnings calls rather than shared with affected communities. Like other multinational corporations, Ford is reacting not just to cost pressures, but to what it sees as an increasingly unstable American business environment, marked by tariffs, labor disputes, regulatory swings, and political infighting. Instead of facing these headwinds, Ford is choosing agility and predictability overseas. The impacts are devastating on the ground. Factory workers in towns once built around Ford plants are left jobless, dealerships that served as community anchors sit shuttered, and local economies begin to collapse in a slow, painful spiral. What was once a brand that symbolized American resilience and prosperity is now emblematic of corporate pragmatism, choosing global supply chain optimization over national loyalty. The company talks about reskilling and future-proofing, but in practice, it has left many American workers with few options and fading hope. This isn't just a business shift, it's a cultural and economic rupture, one that reveals the fragile state of the American middle class and the disappearing promise of stable, dignified industrial work. Ford's new direction is global, lean, and laser-focused on profits and electrification, but the cost is being paid by the very people who once made Ford an icon. The state of America's auto economy is a complex and rapidly evolving situation, shaped by a mixture of economic pressures, shifting global manufacturing strategies, and the rise of electric vehicles, EVs. The once thriving U.S. auto industry, long considered a backbone of the American economy, is in a period of intense transformation. Legacy automakers like Ford, GM, and Chrysler are grappling with the transition to EVs, which demands huge investments in new technology, supply chains, and production capabilities. While the push for electric vehicles is seen as necessary for the future of the industry, it has come with significant growing pains. These companies are facing rising production costs, supply chain disruptions, and the pressure to compete with global giants like Tesla, which already leads in EV innovation and market share. At the same time, many manufacturers are shifting production overseas to Mexico, India, and China to take advantage of cheaper labor, more favorable trade terms, and proximity to emerging markets. This has resulted in job losses in U.S. factory towns, where once stable middle-class jobs are evaporating as automakers prioritize cost efficiency over loyalty to their American workforce. U.S. workers have been promised the return of jobs, yet many factories are closing or relocating, leaving workers with fewer opportunities in areas once dependent on auto manufacturing. Moreover, the political landscape, marked by tariffs, trade wars, and regulatory uncertainty, has further complicated the situation, making it harder for American automakers to compete globally. Ford, for example, has quietly reduced its domestic presence, choosing to relocate key production facilities abroad, where it can avoid the economic volatility of doing business in the U.S. The cost of manufacturing in America has become untenable for many, with tax incentives and subsidies from governments in other countries offering a better return on investment. The impact on local economies is profound. Dealerships and supply chain businesses in factory towns are closing, local economies are shrinking, and the social fabric of these areas is unraveling as people leave in search of work. Meanwhile, imported vehicles are flooding the U.S. market, and many consumers are increasingly choosing brands that offer more affordable options, leaving the traditional U.S. manufacturers struggling to find their footing. What's left is an industry, stuck between the old guard of combustion engines and the new world of electric vehicles, trying to navigate an increasingly competitive and unpredictable global market. In this environment, the American auto economy is no longer the powerhouse it once was. Instead, it's a fragmented, volatile sector, caught in the crosswinds of technological change, global competition, and political turbulence. Unless major, structural shifts occur, the future of the American auto industry may look radically different from the past, and many of the workers who built it may find themselves left behind.